Hello again, everybody. This is Pastor Tony, and welcome to lesson number 12 of our 5th series in the Healing 101 course. And of course, in this series, we're talking about receiving, appropriating by faith what God has already made available through the finished work of Jesus. Again, by His stripes, you were healed. This already belongs to you, already a done deal in the realm of the Spirit. But of course, faith bridges that gap and brings that healing reality from the unseen realm over to the seen realm and causes it to manifest in your life and in your body. But we're talking about some things concerning faith. Now, even though faith in and of itself, the principle, the law of faith is simple, it basically swings on two hinges: believing in the heart, speaking with the mouth. What is not easy many times is uprooting and eliminating all the other doubts and the unbelief that we've allowed in our belief system and our heart that really just choke out faith and nullify and negate the manifestation of what God has said in His Word. But that's what we're trying to do right now, is uproot and eliminate all those things. And of course, that means that sometimes we're going to have to confront some things in our heart that's been rooted in there a long time, deeply entrenched. But you know, when you confront something, a belief system in your heart that is not correct with the Word, I'm talking about not what I'm saying, but what the Word of God says, then you have a choice to make. Either you can allow that old traditional entrenched belief system that has really kept you down and kept you out of the perfect will of God to just reign supreme in your life, or you can dethrone that thing. You can get it out of the driver's seat, throw it out of the car, and allow a belief system in the Word of God to take its place and to be on the throne of your life. And that's what it's all about. That's when you're going to begin to get the positive results, positive changes in our life that line up with the Word of God. You know, in the last lesson we were talking about from Mark chapter 9, how Jesus had come off the Mount of Transfiguration, and we know the story there, how the father had brought his son to Jesus' disciples while he was up on the Mount of Transfiguration to deliver and to heal him. He had been tormented by an evil spirit that tried to destroy him, a self-sabotage kind of devil. And so, you know, Jesus came down, and there was a discussion, an argument going on, and he asked what was going on down here. What are you discussing with my disciples? And that father of the child spoke up out of the crowd and said, I brought you my son who has a demonic spirit who throws him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. He said, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Well, Jesus turned it around and put it in new covenant terminology, which is what he was introducing here. And he said, if you can believe, all things are possible to him that believes. That tells us two things right there. That is a loaded statement. It tells us, first of all, we have the capacity and the potential of believing for the impossible, of having and using the God kind of faith. But second of all, it tells us that whosoever can believe for whatsoever. Just like Mark chapter 11, 23 and 24 tells us, that it gives us a blank check, that all things become possible to him that believes. Not him who works, earns, uses fleshly strength, the strength of men, but hooks up with the power, the ability, strength, and resources of God, of heaven, through the God kind of faith. But you know, this man had some doubts about that. But Jesus met him where he was, and he got exactly what he came for. Thank God. You know, but if you took just up until when Jesus came down at face value, until Jesus got involved in this whole scene right here, if you just took that for what it at face value, you would say, well, there was a failure there. Obviously, in the mysterious will of God, it wasn't God's will to deliver that boy. But Jesus came along and did what his disciples could not do, which was deliver that boy from that demonic possession and oppression. So you have to say, you know, a lot of times what our life experience isn't just perfectly the will of God. For us to say that everything that happens in our life is the perfect will of God means that we are believing perfectly, that we are that everything in our life is in perfect order and it just pertains to the will of God. We know that's not true. There's a lot of people who are not receiving Jesus and are not born again and are not on their way to heaven. But you know what? The Bible tells us that it's not God's will that any should perish. God didn't send his son down here to go through all that he did so that he would leave most of the population out and disqualify them. So we say that we can see right there, and Jesus said this in what we call the Lord's Prayer right at the beginning. He said, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So that tells us right there that God's will in heaven and what we're experiencing here on the earth, there's a discrepancy there. But that doesn't mean that we can't align those two. We can't align our life experience here on the earth with the perfect will of God in heaven. If that way, because Jesus is telling us to pray along that line. He wouldn't tell us to pray, "God, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," if there was no way for God's perfect will and kingdom to manifest in our life here on the earth. So a lot of people are just discounting and just saying, well, if we want the perfect will, experience the perfect will of God and all these things, we're going to have to wait till we get to heaven. Well, that's not what Jesus was teaching us to pray. He's teaching us to pray that we can have and experience the perfect will of God on earth in our own life. Now, we can't enforce that for everybody, but we can experience that for our own life, and when we personally receive and use the God kind of faith. Now, I want to go over to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, because I want to kind of get a behind the scenes view of the disciples who failed to deliver that boy and why that happened. And so we're going to get a good account of that in Matthew chapter 17. Matthew chapter 17, verse 19, "Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?'" Now again, this is after that situation. They couldn't cast that spirit out. Jesus came along and did cast that spirit out, just like the will of God was and is for that boy. And so that perplexed the disciples. Now, the reason they asked this question, if they believe, like most of religious tradition has taught us, that, you just going to have to accept whatever life throws at you. Whatever life throws at you, that is the perfect will of God. God's got a purpose and a reason for it being. Well, if that were true, then they would not have ever asked that question right here. And if they didn't believe they could cast that spirit out, and if they didn't believe that it was God's perfect will for that boy to be delivered and set free and healed, they wouldn't be asking this question. Now, you look back in Matthew chapter 10, verse 1, and you see that Jesus gave all of his disciples at that point power and authority over unclean spirits and over sickness and disease, to heal the sick and the diseased. And they went out doing that, obviously, and they were getting results. I mean, they came back. This is Luke chapter 10's account, verses 17, 18, 19. They came back and they began to give a report of what was happening as they went out into the highways and the byways and began to minister according to that power and authority that Jesus gave them. And they said, even the demons are subject to us through your name. I mean, they were just overjoyed at that. Jesus kind of straightened up their perspective a little bit there to more of an eternal perspective. Don't just get caught up in demons. Get caught up that your name is written in the Lamb's book of life, eternity. But anyway, that's another story. But so we see that they got some good experience, some positive results through their ministry. But in this one situation, they didn't get results. They failed. I mean, they obviously failed because Jesus did it. They wanted to know why it happened. I'm glad that these disciples asked some of the questions they did. I'm glad that they asked Jesus some of the hard questions that a lot of people are afraid to answer or ask of the Lord because they don't want to get the answer. Because they basically would just fall apart like a $2 suitcase, if the Lord offered them any kind of correction at all. Listen, correction does not mean rejection. Do we understand that? We need correction in our life because we're not perfect. We're not and I'm glad that they asked some of the questions and made some of the comments they did, because Jesus was able to give us some answers because of their questions and because of their failures many times. That just opens the door of how to succeed in this. We don't have to go through the same failures that everybody else. So notice in verse 20. Now, this is very simple right here. Notice Jesus said to them, it was because of your unbelief. It was because of your unbelief. Now I want you to see what the focus is on right here. He says because of your unbelief. Now Jesus didn't say, now I think there's a couple of translations that kind of, paraphrase it this way, because of your little faith, because of your small faith. But that's not what he said. He says because of your unbelief. Now obviously they had been getting results, but in this situation there was some unbelief. They crossed over a line of unbelief and got over into an area of unbelief where it negated and nullified their faith in their heart, and they didn't see the positive results they had gotten everywhere else and that Jesus came along and got. He says, because of your unbelief, for assuredly, there's that phrase again, for assuredly, I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed. All right, now notice, he's talking about their faith right here. He said, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. First of all, I want you to see again where it really gives us the principle of faith, believing in the heart, no unbelief, and saying with the mouth. He said, in other words, if you say to this mountain, there it is again, just like Mark chapter 11. He said, if you say to this mountain, move from here to there. That's all that was required of them to do. Believe that what they say is going to come to pass in their heart, with no doubt. Move from here to there, and it will move. It's going to happen. And nothing will be impossible for you. So he actually gives them the same commentary that he gave that father of that child. When he told him in Mark chapter 9, verse 23, he said, all things are possible to him that believes. If you can believe, all things are possible to him that believes. He's telling his disciples the same thing about believing and saying. Now he didn't talk about the saying part with the father of that child, but obviously he did here. Obviously somewhere their believing and speaking got sideways, and that caused them not to get the results that they were looking for. So he said, nothing will be impossible. In other words, all things are possible to you. In other words, nothing being impossible means all things are possible. All right, same thing. Now notice right here, he says, I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed. Now again, there's a couple of things about this right here that we need to point out that I think are very important for us in our lesson of faith. First of all, a mustard seed. Have you ever seen a mustard seed? It is teeny weeny. All right, it's about the size of a pinhead, so to speak. Very, very small. Jesus made a commentary on this in Mark chapter 4. That the kingdom of God is like someone who goes out and sows, a seed like a mustard seed. Even though it's the smallest seed, it grows up and becomes the greatest herb in all the garden, so that birds of the air and everything is taking nest in it. So in other words, it doesn't require big faith. It doesn't require large faith. See, that's why I reject the paraphrase there that, it says Jesus said, because of the littleness of your faith, because he would be contradicting what he went on to say about having small faith, the faith of the size of a mustard seed. So it's not the size of the faith. It's not the measure of the big measure. In other words, if you want to move a big mountain, you're going to have bigger faith. That's not what he's saying here. It's just using your faith. It's using what you got. Okay? So in other words, it doesn't require big faith. But there's something about the mustard seed. The reason he also used the mustard seed, not just the size of it and the potential in it, but there's something about a mustard seed that I've read in other commentaries. I believe this to be true according to what I've read up on it. That a mustard seed, mustard plants are one of the few plants that you can't, crossbreed. In other words, you can't take something and graft it in and make some kind of a cross, some kind of a hybrid type of deal with it. In other words, he's talking about the purity of the mustard seed. You can't graft anything in. You can't crossbreed it. You can't do something else with it to alter it, to some kind of genetically altered type situation here. It's one of the few in the world you can't do that with. And so he's not only talking about the size of the mustard seed, he's also talking about the purity and the incorruptibility of altering the mustard seed with unbelief. So really, this is what he's talking about right here. Notice right here, he says, because of your unbelief. Their unbelief got down in their heart and corrupted the faith that was in their heart. See, it wasn't the size of the faith, it's the purity of the faith. It's the incorruptibility of the faith that we're talking about. And see, that's what we need to understand about what Jesus is saying. See, again, the father of the child, he cried out and he said, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. In other words, he had unbelief up here, but belief in his heart. Now, if he would have let the doubts and the unbelief up in his head drop down in his heart, they would have negated and nullified his believing and really just canceled it out right there. See, it's not the littleness of your faith. It's not even a lack of faith. It's not weakness in faith so much, because you have the faith of Jesus in its pure form. But he is talking about faith that is not corrupted, that is not nullified by doubts and unbelief. That's why Jesus answered them and said, because of your unbelief. Their unbelief that dropped down in their heart negated and nullified their faith from operating. It basically just canceled it out. And that's what he's talking about right here. That is so important that we get a hold of that right there, because many times we have doubts and unbelief up here, and then the enemy says, well, you thought you were in faith. Now see, you got all those doubts and unbelief. Well, as long as you isolate those to just individual doubts and unbelief and questions in your head, and then eliminate them, just toss them out when they are, and not allow them to get in your heart and get on the throne or get in the driver's seat of your life and of your belief system, they're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to nullify your faith. Now see, just like Abraham became fully persuaded. What does that mean right there? Fully persuaded means there was no room for any doubts. No room for not being persuaded and convinced. And he got that way by considering the Word and not considering everything else in the world. By not wavering around and being double-minded right here. And see, that's what James is talking about. We go to James chapter 1 in verses 5 through 8. It says, if anyone lacks wisdom, and we could say lacks anything. Wisdom is one of those things that we can be lacking in. We can be lacking in healing, okay? And that's what we're trying to receive. He says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach. And notice, it will be given to him. In other words, there's no question about the giving in. The problem is on the receiving in. Verse 6, but let him ask in faith with no doubting. Let him ask in faith with no doubting. In other words, pure faith, incorruptible faith, persuaded faith. Let him ask in faith with no doubting. He said, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. See, that's a picture of a person who's allowed doubts and unbelief to get down in their heart and begin to contend. That's really what that word is right there in the Greek. To contend with, to oppose. They're allowing doubts and unbelief to get from their head down in their heart and begin to fight, struggle, and oppose and contend with belief in the Word, belief in God. And see, notice right there, at that point you begin to be like a wave being driven like the sea, driven and tossed by the winds. In other words, circumstances, they're going to change you. You're just never going to be stable. In verse number 7, for let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. Notice that. It's the receiving in, not the giving in. Receiving in. You're not in a position of receiving anything from the Lord when you've allowed doubts to get down and corrupt and pollute the faith and the belief system of your heart and contend with it and then nullify and negate it. He said he's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Well, we're going to look at one situation, example of that real quick in the closing moments in today's lesson, found in Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5, and this is about a ruler of a synagogue there. Jairus was his name. And he came to Jesus one day, fell down at Jesus' feet, and said, my little daughter lies at the point of death. In other words, when he left his house, his daughter was in bad shape. She was on her deathbed, lying at the point of death. But he made this faith statement right here. He said, just come and lay your hands on her and she will be healed. That's a faith statement. That's a faith declaration. No questioning that. There's no doubts in that question. He didn't say, come and see if, come lay hands on, see if it's the will of God, see if she can be healed. He said, come and lay hands on her and she will be healed. Well, Jesus just followed him in faith. His faith began to really lead the ministry of Jesus. Jesus followed him, whole entourage with him. And of course, about that time, that's when the woman with the issue of blood showed up and took her healing. And we'll talk about her a little bit later on in detail. But she took her healing. But at the time when she was getting through her testimony, telling Jesus what happened, and Jesus said, daughter, your faith has made you well, there were some people from Jairus' house that caught up with the crowd, caught up with Jairus and Jesus, met him on the way somewhere, and said, don't trouble the teacher any further. Your daughter is now dead. And that's where we're going to pick it up in verse 35. It says, while he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? In other words, according to them, that just crossed the line for them where they could not believe anymore. They couldn't believe that it was possible for this daughter to be raised from the dead. And so they just said, they just admonished and exhorted Jairus just to not trouble the teacher anymore. They didn't see Jesus as Lord. They saw him as just a teacher. And so they said, don't trouble anymore. Your daughter's dead. In other words, just forget it. Well, these are words that were contradictory to what Jairus was believing for. See, he was being challenged right here in his faith. He was being challenged of whether he was going to continue to believe in Jesus and believe the word, or he was going to just give up and quit right here. See, you're never going to be out of the game until you quit. Okay? So notice verse 36, as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken. The Amplified brings it out this way. Jesus overheard that word that was spoken, and he ignored it. In other words, he heard it, but he ignored it. Ignoring means he didn't give any credence to it. He didn't give any value or honor to it. It wasn't going to get in and toy with his faith and corrupt it. And he was going to exhort Jairus to continue on. So he says, as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he overheard it. He knew that these words, if they got in Jairus' heart, they would produce unbelief and doubt, and that would cut this miracle off right here. So he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. I want you to see that right there. See, if fear enters in, that means unbelief and doubt have entered in the heart. They're in the driver's seat right now. See, that's an indication, a manifestation of doubt and unbelief. You're not going to believe God and be in fear. You're not going to have, you can't have both going on in the heart. You can't have, be scared and be in fully persuaded faith at the same time. Can't happen. Listen, that doesn't mean you're not going to have thoughts of fear up here, but you can screen those out. You can toss them out. You can eliminate those. Get rid of them. You don't have to. You can resist those. Those are thoughts of the enemy, fiery darts that are trying to infiltrate and negate, nullify your faith, so he can cut that miracle off. So he said, do not be afraid, only believe. Only believe. In other words, just keep on walking. And see, that's some of the greatest advice you can get when you are challenged with contradictory things, even the worst kind of reports like Jairus got right here, and you are trying to stand in faith. Sometimes what you do is you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you have to remember who you're believing in. Remember what you're believing. You're standing on the word that is unchangeable. It'll change anything. and you just got to keep on walking. Just keep on walking and keep the confession. Hold fast to your confession of faith. So he said, do not be afraid, only believe. In other words, only believe means don't allow doubts and unbelief to penetrate your heart and pollute and corrupt, negate and nullify what you've already said, your statement of faith up until this point. Well, verse 37, Jesus permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Verse 38, then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. I mean, they were carrying on. You know, and if you're not solid in heart faith right here, if you don't have this thing settled, when you come across this right here, this kind of manifestation, where you got not only a bad situation that's gone worse, but now you got the whole crowd that's in on this, just wailing in unbelief. And these are professional tumulters, by the way. I think I've heard they would go around and carry on and do all this kind of stuff, and they were just loud. Their voices of defeat were loud. But verse 39, then he came in and said, why make this commotion and weep? This child is not dead, but sleeping. Boy, that set them free right there when Jesus made that statement. Because they, all natural, on all accounts and purposes, this child was dead. Jesus comes in there, she's not dead, but she's sleeping. Why are you carrying on like this? In verse 40, they turned on him. They ridiculed him. See, if you got any fear of man, that'll shut down this faith that we're talking about. If you're worried about what everybody else is saying, what everybody else is thinking about you, if you're worried about the crowd and pleasing the crowd like a lot of people are, you're not going to walk very far in faith, because they'll turn on you. That whole crowd began to ridicule Jesus, make fun of him, mock him. But you know what he did? He put them all outside. He had to put all that doubts, unbelief, those voices of unbelief, he had to put it out. And so he took it out and then took the father and mother of the child and Peter, James, and John. And then he entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said, Talitha cumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. Notice they kept walking in faith. They didn't give up. They didn't allow their faith to be corrupted and nullified by doubts, unbelief, and fears, and even the crowd, and the ridicule and the mocking of the crowd. And they saw the end of their faith, which was a miracle. I tell you, that's powerful. And that's what we're going to see as well. That's all the time I've got for this lesson. If you'd like additional materials and resources, you can always visit us on the web, tonycowan.org, and we will see you in the next lesson.
Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out this video. We hope that it really blessed you. Hope you got a lot out of it. Make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you also turn on the notifications so that you get notified whenever we post a new video. Also, go ahead and hit that like button. And if God's doing awesome things in your life like we're believing Him for, then we would love for you to share that with us. So leave us a comment. Let us know all the good things God's doing in your life. We'll see you next time.